I was down in my dad's work shed, and he was gonna find some screws for me because I was gonna put up some shelves, I think it was, and I was just waiting for him to go through these screw boxes, and I found like there's so many things in my dad's work shed, it's like crowded with things. And I found this box with some stuff, leftover stuff from my granddad's house, and I picked up these notebooks. And I realized it was the care team's notes from their visits like during the last 2 years of my granddad's lives. And as I was going through these notes, it's mostly like medical things, but also every now and then a couple of sentences about his everyday life, what he was doing and thinking about, feeling, and so on. Boo just came into my imaginary imagination, and I was like, oh wow, I need to write a story about an old man's perspective on aging, on life, and it kind of like he was already finished. The whole story just came to me, like the beginning, the end, everything. And I should say that too, like I'm also familiar with this care team, or like we call it home service in Swedish. It's a service that is entitled to everyone, and it's governmentally funded. So it's basically if you write a book about an old man or an old person, you kind of have to include this if it's set in Sweden, because basically everyone go through it. And I've also worked myself in home services.
And
So
so,
as
oh, so
yeah, sorry.
that's we segue. And so then Ingrid appeared out of sort of talk about Ingrid, if you would. And then,
Yeah, so Ingrid is inspired by a person that I used to work with in the care team that actually looked after my granddad. But I worked in that care team after my granddad passed. Um, it's all fiction, what I've come up with, but the essence of Ingrid is inspired by this person that I used to work with. Ingrid has she's very proud of her job, and she's really good at it, despite being very underpaid, and it's quite hard work in many ways. For me, I thought this is one of the most interesting jobs I've had, but for me, it was really emotionally hard because you get very attached to the people that you work with. And on a Monday, when you come there, like that person might be dead, right? So, because it differs a lot from other kind of care work, or like like when you take care of people at a hospital, right? It's different than, because here you come home to these people and you see their partners and kids and dogs. So you get straight into their lives in a different way than other types of care work. Sixten is, I would say, Bo's closest friend and companion. It's an elkhound, that is a kind of dog that is very common around here, and mostly used as a moose hound for hunting moose. However, there's Sixten is not a hunting dog. He's only for company. And he gives Bo company, but he also gives him, someone to physically touch and care for. So he brings him a lot of meaning, because his Bo is too old to make himself go into town and see his friend, his best friend Ture, so they can only call each other on the phone. And so he's very like close to the house, and Sixten is his best friend basically. And Sixten, yes, was inspired by this one, his body language and so on. I think that it was hard for me to write about people without writing about dogs. I'm that kind of person, human being who prefers dogs over people. Well, I wanted to show how complex it is to age with dignity and what it means to age with dignity and how nothing is black and white, the right way of looking after an aging and eventually dying person. And for Bo, which Ingrid agrees with, it's the best thing is to be with Sixten. Yes, there is a risk that he might fall in the forest when he takes the dog for walks. Yes, there is a risk that maybe Sixten doesn't get as much exercise as he needs, and sometimes Bo might forget that he needs to go out and wee, and. But the positive outcomes, emotional outcomes and physical for Bo are greater. Ingrid thinks. She wouldn't spell it out like that, but she's a dogs person herself and she's looked after so many old people with dogs and animals, so she knows this. And then on the other hand, you've got this son of Bo, Hans, who wants to look after his dad and do he's an only child and he wants to do the very best for his father at the end of his life. But the way he thinks about it is that, yeah, that there is a risk if you have a dog. And he also thinks that like it's not up to the home service, the care people, to walk the dog and so on. So he's quite strict in his way of looking at risks and benefits when it comes to aging.
What about,
But they're all doing the very best, right? But it's hard.
oh, it sounds like it. Frederica is also in the background here. Would you talk about her at all?
Yeah, so Frederica is Bo's wife, and she's moved out of home to a elderly care dementia home because she's suffering from pretty severe dementia, and she can't remember Bo anymore. She can't remember Hans, and the reason why I wanted to write the story because the whole story is told from Bo's perspective to his wife Frederica is because even when our loved ones are gone, they're still so present, right? And we think about them, and the way we go about our day is so colored by the people that are not there anymore. And Fredrika is basically dead, right, to Bo, because she's not the one that she used to be. And I think that, like, for instance, I live in my granddad's old house, and he's been gone for 15 years, right? It's a long time since he passed, but I can still feel his presence when I, take in wood or do things that I did for him or with him. And obviously, like the construction of the house, he's there, and it's comforting. And I think that Sweden is a very secular society, and this is something that we've lost with that, how to keep our loved ones, in our lives without, having to be super religious and like talking about them in the heaven kind of thing, but it's like we just not talk about death or dying instead. And yeah.
From the point of view of dialogue and writing in Bo's voice, what did you hear your grandfather's voice, or was it important to separate yourself from a familiar place of sort of familiarity in that regard?
Yeah, Bo looks like my granddad and he moves like my granddad and they share interests, but the Bo is not my granddad in his personality. Bo is more grumpy. My granddad was more content and not as, you know, angry and slightly aggressive Bo can be sometimes. He's got pretty harsh thoughts and expressions as well. So, and I think that the inspiration for that, Bo's personality was like a mix of men and boys that I've grown up with, but also probably shaped by all the previous research I've been going through in my academic work. So yeah, Bo is not my granddad. I had to separate that a bit, yeah. But I've always been fascinated by masculinity and emotionality, right? How we communicate our feelings and how important that is for our well-being. And I've seen both, like, in my amongst my friends and relatives and neighbors and so on, how the consequences of not being able to put words to your feelings and communicate that to the people around you. So I think that's been a driven force for me to explore and to get a greater understanding of the complexity of that. Because quite often when you look at uh, literature and movies, like in Sweden, basically, that is focused on men that live in the rural north of Sweden, it's very stereotype and it's these big, harsh hunters that don't have any feelings, basically. And I mean, there's something to those stereotypes as well, but it's not everything. And that's something that I've definitely got from the previous research that I've gone through for many years, but also just living here, right? These men are harsh and they go on snowmobiles and hunt and so on, but they are also extremely loving, tender, and caring fathers and partners and friends and so on. So the complexity of masculinity and gender is probably something that I have gotten from my academic work.